The tally board on Corville Yards had not changed in 11 minutes, and that was the first sign that something was wrong. Myra Okafor noticed it the way she noticed everything on the yard now, sideways, without stopping her hands. She was elbow deep in a coolant manifold, and the numbers on the board hung above the catwalk where every worker in Sector 7 could see them.
Quota met. Quota met. Quota met.
Then nothing. No new line. No red mark for a miss. Just silence where a number should have been. 11 minutes was nothing on a normal day. On Corville Yards, 11 minutes of silence from that board meant someone above her pay grade was arguing with someone above theirs, and neither of them wanted to be the one who said the wrong thing first. She wiped her hands on a rag that had been white years before she was born and looked down the length of the refinery deck. Rows of extraction cradles stretched into the haze, each one feeding raw or into a furnace throat taller than a building back on Earth. The air smelled like hot metal and recycled water. It always did. She had stopped noticing the smell the way you stopped noticing your own house. Her brother Deo was 2 cradles down, favoring his left leg. He had torn something in it 3 weeks ago hauling a slag cart, and he had not reported it, because reporting it meant a medical flag, and a medical flag meant a productivity review, and a productivity review meant the difference between staying in Sector 7 with her and being reassigned somewhere she couldn't watch him. Board stuck, he said when she came close enough to hear him over the furnace roar. Board's not stuck. Somebody's slow. Same thing, from here. She almost smiled. It was the kind of joke you made when you'd been on a station like this long enough that the only thing left to laugh at was the machine that owned you. Corville Yards belonged to the Vashti, and the Vashti did not fight wars the way some species did. They filed claims. 12 years ago, back when Myra was barely old enough to remember the negotiations on the newsfeeds, a trade dispute over a mineral corridor near the edge of human space had gone to a tribunal that Earth's delegation did not understand well enough to win. The judgment was not violent. It was administrative. Earth owed a debt in refined or it could not pay in ore, so it paid in labor instead. 400,000 indentured workers shipped out to stations like this one, contracts running decades long, renewed automatically for any infraction on the books. Myra had been 11 when her family's ship left Lagos orbit. She did not remember choosing anything about this life. She had simply grown up inside it, the way a plant grows around a fence. The Vashti themselves were tall and narrow, built of jointed silicate plating over something that moved like muscle but caught the light like glass. They did not raise their voices. They did not need to. Every one of them belonged to a rank, and every rank belonged to a rank above it, all the way up to the Overseer General's office on the top ring of the station, and the whole structure ran on the assumption that any problem, correctly reported through the correct channel, would eventually reach someone with the authority to solve it. It was, Myra had come to understand, the only thing they were truly afraid of getting wrong. Not losing workers. Not losing ore. Losing the shape of the order itself. The board finally blinked. A new line appeared. Not a quota number. A maintenance alert, station-wide priority, routed through channels that made half the workers on the catwalk go quiet without being told to. Reactor Core 3, thermal variance, escalating to Sector Supervisor. Deo read it over her shoulder. That's the one under the east dorms. I know which one it is. You worked on it 2 shifts ago. You said the regulator seal was going. She had said that. She had also filed the report the way she was supposed to, through her line supervisor, who had filed it up to the shift coordinator, who would file it up to the sector engineer, who would eventually, if the chain held, file it to someone with the authority to approve a part replacement that Myra could have finished in 40 minutes with the right tool and nobody looking over her shoulder. She looked at the board again. 11 minutes of silence, and now this. They're going to escalate it right through dinner, she said quietly. Deo didn't answer. He didn't have to. Everyone on that catwalk had learned the same lesson. Over years of small failures nobody was allowed to fix quickly. The Vashti built machines that never broke by design and people who were never permitted to act without permission, and when both assumptions turned out to be wrong at the same time, there was no plan for what came next. Somewhere below the dorms, Reactor 3 ticked a half-degree hotter, and nobody with the authority to care about it yet had been told. Overseer Rendulo had been assigned to Corville Yards for 4 years, and in that time he had learned exactly one uncomfortable truth about the species under his supervision. They solved problems in the wrong order. He stood on the observation gantry above Sector 7 with a data slate in one clawed hand, watching the coolant crews work below. A proper Vashti crew, faced with a thermal variance report, would wait. They would wait because waiting was correct. The report would climb the chain, each level confirming what the level below had already confirmed, until someone with clearance to authorize a fix gave the order, and then the fix would happen exactly once, exactly as specified, with no wasted motion and no risk of an unauthorized hand touching a regulated system. It was elegant. It had worked for the Vashti for longer than human civilization had existed in any form he'd bothered to study. What he could not explain to his own satisfaction was why the humans down on that deck kept looking at each other instead of looking at the board. "You're staring at Sector 7 again," said Overseer General Kate Thurn, arriving behind him with the particular quiet of someone who had never needed to announce himself in his career. Thurn ran the entire yards. He had the kind of patience that came from never once having been wrong in a way that mattered to his record. "Thermal variance on Core 3, Wren said. "Escalation's moving slowly." Escalation moves at the correct speed. That is what escalation means. The variance is already a half degree past the last reading. Thurn's plating shifted in the gesture Wren had learned to read as mild disapproval. "Then the report will note that when it reaches the sector engineer." Wren did not argue. Arguing with Thurn was not how anyone advanced on Corville yards, and Wren intended to advance. But he kept watching the deck below, because something about the humans bothered him in a way he had never managed to file a proper report about. They talked while they worked. Not to their supervisors. To each other. A junior worker would lean over to an older one and ask a question, and the older one would show them something with their hands, right there on the deck, in the middle of a shift, with no authorization logged anywhere. Wren had pulled the shift records once, out of curiosity, and found that nearly a third of all minor repairs on Corville yards were completed faster than the official maintenance schedule accounted for, with no clear record of who had actually done the extra work or when. It should have concerned him. Unlogged labor was, technically, a violation. He had filed exactly one report about it in 4 years, and the response from above had been a single line: productivity within acceptable variance, no action required. He watched Myra Okafor. He knew her name. He made a habit of learning names. It was one of the small ways he told himself he was different from Thurn, crouched down beside a coolant line that was not, according to any authorization he'd seen, scheduled for her attention today. "That worker is not cleared for Core 3, he said. "Then she will not touch it," Thurn said, already turning to leave. "The system does not permit what it does not permit." Wren watched a moment longer. Myra wasn't touching the reactor housing. She was talking to a younger man beside it, gesturing at a valve, walking him through something with her hands the way she might have taught a child to tie a knot. The younger man nodded, and moved to a panel 2 systems away from the one flagged in the report, and made an adjustment there instead, something small, something that wouldn't show up on any authorized repair order because it wasn't a repair, technically. It was a workaround. A pressure bleed rerouted through a line that wasn't supposed to be touched until someone 3 ranks above Wren said it could be. The half-degree variance on the display stopped climbing. Wren stood on the gantry a long time after Thurn had gone, watching a problem solve itself in a way his own species' entire command structure had no name for. He did not file a report about it. He told himself it was because the numbers were within acceptable variance now, and there was nothing to report. He was not sure that was the reason. The circuit did not have a name for the first 6 years of its existence, because naming a thing made it something that could be found. Myra had learned it from Sadiq Bello, who had learned it from someone before him, on a different ship, in a different decade, and none of them had ever written it down. It was simple enough that it didn't need writing down. If you knew how to do something that kept people alive or kept people out of a medical flag, you taught it to 2 other people, quietly, on shift, with your hands and not your voice. You never taught it to more than 2 at once, because 2 people could talk to each other without anyone above them noticing, and 3 people talking looked like a meeting. That was the whole of it. No leader. No meetings. No list of members anywhere, because there was no list. Just a slow, unowned current of knowledge running underneath the official structure of the yards, teaching people how to bleed a pressure line before it became a report, how to wrap a torn tendon so it read as a limp instead of an injury, how to reroute a bad regulator without anyone above sector level ever hearing about it. Sadiq had been the one who taught Myra, back when she was 17 and furious at a system that had assigned her mother to a furnace deck with a bad hip and no accommodation, because accommodations required a review, and reviews took months, and her mother did not have months of comfortable waiting in her. "You don't fix the big thing," Sadiq told her then, in the mess hall, low enough that the table beside them couldn't hear. "You never get permission for the big thing. You fix the small thing next to it, the thing nobody's watching, and you teach somebody else how, so it isn't just you who knows." That's not fixing anything. That's hiding. It's the only kind of fixing they've left us room to do. She had hated that answer for years. She still didn't fully love it. But she had used it more times than she could count, and tonight, with Deo's leg still not reported and the tally board still showing the aftermath of an escalation that had taken 4 hours to authorize a repair the circuit had solved in 40 minutes and never claimed, she understood it better than she wanted to. You didn't log it, Deo said later, back in their bunk row, voice pitched low. The reroute. Nobody's going to know you fixed it. Nobody's supposed to know. Doesn't that ever bother you? Doing the work and not getting the credit. Myra looked up at the underside of the bunk above hers, where a previous occupant had scratched a small, worn spiral into the metal, the same mark she'd seen in 3 other dorms on 3 other decks, always in places only someone lying exactly where she was lying would ever see it. Getting credit means somebody wrote your name down, she said. Writing your name down means somebody can find it later. I'd rather they never know how many of us there are. How many of us are there? She didn't answer that either, because she genuinely didn't know, and because some questions were safer left open even between siblings. What she did know was that the reroute she'd taught the younger man that afternoon would be taught by him to 2 more people within the week, and one of those 2 would already half know it from somebody else, the way a rumor sometimes turns out to be a memory shared by more people than started it. Down on the observation gantry, unseen by either of them, Overseer Rendulo had begun keeping a private file. He told himself it was professional curiosity. He did not show it to anyone, including Thurn. The failure that nearly ended the circuit came from the one direction none of them had built a workaround for, attention from above that actually listened. It started with Ren's file. 4 months of quiet observation had become 11 pages of patterns he could not stop noticing once he'd started looking. Repairs completed before authorization. Injuries that healed faster than their log severity should have allowed. A spiral mark scratched into metal in places that made no sense unless you assumed someone wanted it seen only by whoever slept in that exact bunk. He had never meant for it to become a real report. But Overseer General Thurn had a habit of reviewing junior officers' private slates during quarterly efficiency audits, a habit Ren had known about and, in 4 years, never once been foolish enough to forget. He forgot it this time. Thurn read all 11 pages standing in Ren's own quarters, plating utterly still, which Ren had learned by now was worse than any visible anger. You have documented an organized violation of station protocol, Thurn said, and instead of reporting it when you found the first instance, you built a file. I wasn't certain what I was seeing. You were certain enough to keep watching for 4 months. Thurn set the slate down with a precision that felt more like a verdict than a gesture. This will be reported. Properly. Tonight. Ren did not sleep. He told himself it was because he was recalculating the shape of his career, which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was smaller and harder to look at directly. Somewhere in those 11 pages of patterns, he had stopped seeing a violation and started seeing something that looked, uncomfortably, like the only working version of cooperation he had witnessed in his entire life on Corval Yards. By the following shift, the order had already moved down through channels faster than any maintenance report ever had, because a violation of authority moved through the Vashti hierarchy with none of the deliberate patience reserved for repairs. Every sector supervisor received the same directive. Identify unauthorized informal instruction between workers, isolate the participants, terminate the practice. Myra heard about it from 3 different people inside 2 hours, which told her, more than anything else could have, how close the circuit had come to being seen without ever being found. They know it exists, Sadiq said, when the 2 of them managed a private minute in the tool cage off Sector 7. He looked older than she'd ever seen him look, which frightened her more than the news itself. They don't have names yet. Not many. But they know the shape of it. So we stop. We can't stop. Half the deck would be flagged for injuries inside a week if we did. But we go quiet. No new pairs. No teaching until this passes. It was the only sensible order, and Myra hated it exactly as much as she'd hated Sadiq's advice the first time he'd given it to her, years ago, at 17, furious about her mother's hip. She went back to her post and did her assigned work and nothing else, for the first time in 6 years, and felt the whole deck around her doing the same, a current that had run for a decade suddenly holding its breath. That was the moment Reactor Housing 4, on the far side of the station from the one that had triggered this entire chain of attention, began venting heat into a support strut nobody had inspected in 3 years, because the inspection schedule for that strut wasn't due for another 11 months, and the Vashti system that had built Corval yards did not have a category for a problem that arrived early. The strut failure did not announce itself with an alarm. It announced itself with a sound, a long groan through the station's bones that every worker on the east side of Corval yards felt in their teeth before they heard it, and then the lights in the east dormitory ring dropped to half power all at once. Myra was 3 decks away when it happened, and she felt the floor shift a half degree under her feet, the kind of shift a station that size should never make. She was running before she'd finished deciding to run, because Deo bunked in the east ring, and because 6 years of training herself to notice small wrong things had left her with no ability to ignore a large one. By the time she reached the connecting corridor, Vashti's security plating had already sealed the access hatch, standard protocol, and a queue of workers was building against it while, somewhere on the other side, the ring's own emergency systems tried to identify the failure through the correct channel. Overseer Rendulo arrived at the same hatch from the opposite direction, out of breath in a way he hadn't been since training, and found Thurn already there, reading a status report off a slate with an expression Ren had never seen on him before, because Thurn had never before needed one. Structural support beneath the east ring has failed at 2 points, Thurn said. Life support in that section will fail within the hour unless the load is redistributed. Then redistribute it. The redistribution requires authorization from Engineering Command, which requires confirmation from the Overseer General's office, which requires... Thurn stopped himself, and for the first time in 4 years Ren watched him actually hear his own sentence. Which requires you, Ren said quietly, and you're standing right here. The correct sequence of confirmations exists to prevent catastrophic error. The sequence takes 40 minutes on a good day. You just told me we have less than an hour before people in that ring stop breathing. Thurn did not answer, because there was no answer built into him for this. He had spent his whole career trusting that any problem, filed correctly, would find someone above him with both the authority and the time to solve it, and for the first time he was standing at the top of that chain himself, with a station groaning under his feet and a form he was required to complete before he could act. On the other side of the sealed hatch, 400 people were breathing air that would not last the hour, and among them, favoring a leg he had never reported, was Deo Okafor, who had no idea that the entire structure meant to protect him had just discovered the exact size of the gap between filing a problem and solving one. Sadiq Bello reached the hatch 6 minutes after Myra, moving faster than his knees should have allowed, and found her already arguing with a security officer twice her height who kept repeating the same sentence in the same flat tone, as though repetition alone might make the words true. Emergency protocol is engaged. Stand back from the hatch. Your protocol is going to take 40 minutes and my brother has maybe 30, Myra said, and the officer's plating did the small shifting motion that Vashti made instead of blinking, uncomprehending, because in his entire career no one had ever told him a protocol had a flaw, only that it had a pace. Sadiq put a hand on her shoulder before she said something that would get her flagged for insubordination on top of everything else. Myra. They're not moving fast enough. I know. Look at me. This is what we are for. She turned, and for the first time in 6 years of quiet unowned repairs and never logged reroutes, she saw Sadiq do something none of them had ever done before. He raised his voice, in public, in front of a Vashti officer, loud enough to carry down the corridor. Anyone who's ever worked a load-bearing strut, to me, now. It should not have worked. It broke every rule the circuit had built itself around, the rule that said you never gather more than 2 at a time, the rule that said you never let anyone above you see the shape of what you knew. But it was not a meeting Sadiq was calling. It was a triage, and the difference mattered more than either of them could have explained to Thurn in that moment. 6 workers peeled away from the growing crowd within a minute. A 7th arrived from 2 decks up, someone Myra had taught a coolant reroute to 8 months before and never spoken to since. An 8th was the young man from Sector 7 who'd bled the pressure line under her direction the week the tally board went silent. None of them had a plan. What they had was 6 years of small, unclaimed lessons passed hand to hand across a station that had never once officially acknowledged they existed, and in the space of 90 seconds those lessons assembled themselves into something that looked, to anyone watching from above, exactly like chaos, and was in fact the only functioning chain of command left standing. Ren Dulo, still beside the sealed hatch, watched it happen and understood, with the sudden clarity of something he had been circling for 4 months without letting himself land on it, that he was looking at the thing his own species' entire structure could not build even if it tried for 1,000 years, authority that didn't need to be granted, because it had already been earned, quietly, one taut hand at a time, by people no rank chart had ever recognized. Overseer, Thurn said behind him, voice tight in a way Ren had never heard. The confirmation from Engineering Command has not yet processed. Then don't wait for it, Wren said, and unsealed the hatch himself. The East Ring, when the hatch finally opened, was not the scene of panic Wren had braced for. It was worse, in its way, because it was quiet. 400 people conserving breath in air already gone thin and metallic, waiting for a system that had not yet decided how to save them. Myra went through first, Sadiq's team behind her, and split without a word into 3 groups, because 6 years of teaching people the same repairs meant none of them needed to be told what to do once they saw the failure. 2 struts, buckled where the aging support frame met the outer hull, venting heat and pressure into a cavity that was never meant to hold either. The official fix, the one sitting in a queue somewhere above Thurn's authority, called for a full structural replacement, a job of days, done by certified engineers, following a sequence that existed to prevent any single mistake from becoming a catastrophe. There was no time for the official fix. There was only time for the workaround, the small thing next to the big thing, the trick Sadiq had taught Myra in a mess hall a decade before her brother's life would ever depend on it. You don't fix a failing strut in an hour. You redistribute its load onto every system around it that can bear a little more weight than it was designed for, buying the ring enough time for the real fix to happen later, properly, by people with the authority to do it right. It took 11 people, working in pairs the way the circuit had always worked, passing tools and instructions hand-to-hand across a corridor Vashti protocol had never imagined being crossed this way. Deo, favoring his bad leg, held a support brace steady with his whole weight rather than say a word about the tendon that had never made it onto any medical flag. Myra welded a bypass junction from memory, the same design she had taught to a stranger on a coolant line months before, because that design had spread through the circuit so widely by now that 3 different people in a corridor could have done it blind. Ren Julo stood in the open hatchway and did not stop them. That was the whole of his choice, in the end, smaller than he'd expected a defining moment to be. He did not authorize anything, because he had no authority to grant that Thurn hadn't already frozen behind a confirmation queue. He simply stood in the door his own protocol told him should stay sealed, and let people work who his entire species command structure insisted could not be trusted to work without permission, and watched the strain readings on his slate begin, slowly, to fall. Thurn arrived behind him in time to see the last brace lock into place and the air recyclers in the East Ring shutter back up to full capacity, 40 minutes before Engineering Command's confirmation finally cleared. This was not authorized, Thurn said, and there was no force left in it, only the sound of a sentence being said because it was the correct sentence to say, not because anyone in the corridor was listening to it as anything but noise. No, Wren agreed. It wasn't. 400 people were breathing normally in a ring that, by every calculation Thurn's office had run, should have gone silent 11 minutes ago. There was no tribunal for what happened in the East Ring, because no one above Thurn's office could agree on what to charge 400 people with, given that the alternative to their unauthorized work was a casualty report large enough to require an inquiry all its own, one that would ask uncomfortable questions about escalation timelines and confirmation queues that Thurn had no wish to answer. What happened instead was quieter, and stranger, and took longer to notice than the emergency itself. Ren Julo filed a new report, 3 weeks later, not about a violation this time. He called it, in the careful language his rank required, a proposal for a revised maintenance framework, one that formally authorized a category of repair his own hierarchy had never had a name for: minor, load-bearing, time-critical interventions performed by trained workers without waiting on the full confirmation chain. He did not use the word circuit. He did not name a single person in it. He simply described, in the driest terms he could manage, a category of human competence his species had spent 12 years standing directly on top of without ever looking down. Thurn did not approve it immediately. Thurn was not built to approve anything immediately. But he also did not bury it, which 4 years of watching him work told Wren was as close to an admission as the Overseer General would ever make. On the tally board above Sector 7, the quota numbers still climbed every shift, because the debt Earth owed was still owed, and no repair, however clever, changed the shape of a legal judgment made a decade earlier by people who had never set foot on Corville yards. But underneath the quota line, a new category appeared for the first time in the station's history, small letters that most workers walked past without a second look: authorized field maintenance, decentralized, pending formal review. Myra read it standing beside Deo, whose leg had finally, quietly, gone onto a medical log that would not cost him his place beside her, because Renjulo had personally signed off on the reassignment himself, in a gesture that would have looked, to anyone who didn't know what the words underneath it meant, like nothing more than routine paperwork. They still own the debt, Deo said. They do. So what changed? Myra looked at the small line of new text on the board. The first thing in 6 years the Vashti hierarchy had ever officially admitted it could not do without them. Nothing they'll ever put a name to, she said. But they know now. However this ends, whenever the debt's paid, however long that takes, they know what we can build when nobody's watching. That doesn't go back in a box. Somewhere above them, in an office that had spent 12 years assuming any problem, correctly reported, would eventually reach someone with the authority to fix it, Overseer General Cade Thurn read Rendulo's proposal a second time, and did not reject it, and understood, in the particular silence that came before any decision he could not yet bring himself to make out loud, that his entire species had built an empire on the assumption that order always ran downward from the top. It had taken one failing strut and 400 people willing to work without permission to show him the current that had been running the other way the whole time. The tally board kept its numbers, but underneath them now, in small letters nobody above Sector 7 had ordered removed, the record of what humanity had actually built on Corval Yards had finally, quietly, begun to write itself down.